So, thank you all for attending, and thank you to the ACRAS team for letting us lead on this part of the project. I'm only going to tell a little bit from the literature review because there's a lot of research in this area, and so I will pick some things carefully. And you just listen to this school that has a lot of wonderful practices installed, and this presentation then is going to be a little bit sad because not all the research is positive. I'm sorry about that. And I'll try to link some of the things I talk about to their practices. So first of all, migrant students are students who are born abroad or they have one or two parents that are born abroad. And very often they speak a different language than that of teaching and the majority of students. That is, of course, we heard in the other presentation that might be challenging when it comes to language, and we'll get back to that. We are going to talk about educational assessment, and this is assessment that seeks to determine how well students are learning, and it's an integral part of the quest of improved education. So, and the purpose of assessment then is to improve student learning and to provide feedback to students, to educators, to parents, to policymakers, and the public about the effectiveness of the educational services. And of course, the feedback you give to students is very different from the feedback the teacher gives to the students, is very different from the feedback a policymaker might get from an international large-scale study or a university group that do research on assessment in schools. And it serves different purposes then. We are going to talk about culturally responsive assessment, and Martin introduced this as assessment that utilizes strategies to acknowledge and respect learners, their cultural backgrounds and approaches to learning. And it's about assessment designs, processes and outcomes that take into account the variations in how students express themselves, how they view learning, their past experiences. And this is what we're going to try to look into. And we're going to look at both formative assessment and summative assessment. We're not going to talk a lot about external large scale. I'm going to use a little bit of this to frame what we are going to talk about, but not a lot. But we would like to talk about the effect of the current assessment practices on migrant students, what these effects are. And we will try to have a main focus on culturally responsive assessment, but we have to talk about some effects of summative assessment practices. And often the current practices have a negative impact on the migrant students, but we should also know that assessment practices that can be adapted to the individual student has a potential to be culturally responsive. And one of these practices that we heard about in the last section is assessment for learning practices. That is a promising practice. We're going to talk about classroom assessment at the classroom level. And good classroom assessment is based on a clear understanding of what it is what's to be learned and what constitutes good work and success in that regard. And of course, this assessment includes feedback to students from their peers, from the students themselves, from the teacher. And this feedback then should include opportunities, it should be used for the students to learn further, for practice, for growth. It's about this science lesson that we looked into. So the feedback is on the process of learning, on the experiment they are conducting, how well it's going, the strategies the students use. But it should also be on the outcome, what they learn, the concepts, and both of these will then further the learning of the students. And the purpose then is to inform not only the teaching, but also the learning. So it can be both the students and the teachers, as we saw. And I'm not going to go through this long list, but there's a variety of formats and opportunities that can be adapted and that can be used. And you can see that at the bottom, I put in a parenthesis that, of course, teachers can also talk to parents about students' prior experiences and prior knowledge and include that in their assessment formats. And that assessment formats don't necessarily have to be written formats. They can be oral, they can be artistic. Yeah, so there's a big a large number of opportunities for teachers to find assessment formats that they can use. But unfortunately, this review also tells us that there is an achievement gap. This means that we can observe differences in achievement scores on tests and exams, and in particular on international large-scale student studies between majority and migrant students. And mainly we see that the migrant students perform below the majority of students, not the majority students, and differences are bigger for the first generation migrant students than for the second generation migrant students. But these differences, they might differ between subjects and countries, and I'll use the PISA study and my own country as an example. In Norway, we've been focusing reading instruction for a long time, and we can see from the PISA studies that we are closing the gap between majority students and second generation migration students when it comes to reading comprehension. But the gap is still there for the first generation migrant students. So we still need to improve the teaching and the assessment practices that we are using in schools. And we also see that for mathematics and science, the gap is the same as it has always been. So it's not widening as in some countries, but it's also not closing. So we need to see how we can make mathematics instruction, science instruction, and assessment better for migrant students. I'll share another example. The OECD used the PISA 2012 mathematics data to look at students with an Arabic origin that moved to the Netherlands or to Finland. And they looked at the test results of these students, and they looked at students with different, with the same level of parental education, the same financial background, so that they looked at students that should be similar. And they see that the students that moved to the Netherlands had far better opportunities for learning. On average, they scored 100 PISA points more than the students that moved to Finland. And that's more than 2 years of schooling, if you look at the amount of teaching that is behind these test scores. So maybe it's not about differences in the students. Maybe it's about differences in opportunities to learn. So what we see then when we see differences on assessment and on test scores, it's not that some students learn less than others. It's about the opportunities that they are provided in their education. We also know that some of the research discuss if these large-scale assessments, like exams and the international tests, if they take into account students' cultural ways of responding. Some students might come from a more collective-oriented culture where they are responsible for responding together, or they're used to frame their answers in a particular way, or maybe they come from a country where they are not supposed to be critical in their thinking, so then responding to critical thinking questions might be very hard. But what we can see is that assessment might have a negative impact on migrant students if its test scores prevent them from going into the further education that they would like to go into. And this is a global problem, I think. So I'm going to continue this a little bit sad journey. I'm going to talk about teacher beliefs that can negatively impact students. Sometimes the research shows that teachers, not all teachers, we know that now, but some teachers might have a deficit perspective. They think there's something wrong with their students. There's something wrong with the migrant students, that they don't learn in the same way as other students. Sometimes teachers blame students' level of language for this, but it's also when students don't conform to their expectations or beliefs about how students should be. And I'll try to explain this because this is difficult to explain. So there's research in New Zealand when they look at students that comes from the Pacifica into the New Zealand schools, and in their culture, students should be very polite. They should not tell others that they don't disagree. They should not criticize the thinking of others. And that goes both towards teachers and their peers, the other students. So when they implemented problem solving and investigative mathematics and science education, they saw that the Pacifica students, they withdrew in the teaching situations. Because for them to say to another student, I don't agree on your hypothesis, I don't think this is correct, is something that they could not do because it's impolite. And they've done a lot of research on this, and if you go into a New Zealand school, you will see that they start the mathematics lesson by saying, what is it to be impolite in the mathematics classroom? The students will raise their hand and say, it's polite to disagree. And then someone will say, but not when we go home. No, because what they are looking at is how they can establish the classroom norms to facilitate the students' participation in the activities, in the teaching activities. And you also need to facilitate the students' participation in assessment situations so that they understand what it is to participate, to become a central participant in this classroom. But the teachers then that don't share these ideas, they believe that the students are passive and that the students are withdrawing, and they often think that there's something wrong with the students rather than that it's necessary to establish these classroom norms for what it means to participate in lessons and assessment situations. There's ideas like this one I put on the bottom, that mathematics is culture-free. And research shows that a lot of mathematics teachers think that they don't have to adapt the mathematics assessments or lessons because the mathematics is the same across the world. Well, the mathematics might be, but mathematics education is a cultural thing. And the curriculum we have, the methods we use, the algorithms we teach the students, if we have pure mathematics or we have problem solving or everyday mathematics, these things are very cultural, and they decide what it means to respond to a task on an assessment. And if we don't know that as mathematics teachers, that we need to think about the cultural, this is hard in English, what we think about the culture of the teaching, and we don't think about how this affects the students, it can negatively impact them. And then, we talked about this in the break, I put on color blindness, and this is something that's very present in a lot of the American research. It has to do when teachers, they are afraid of being seen as racist, so they overlook the culture that students bring to school. They want to treat all the students as equal, so they don't see that the students bring cultural ways of responding, cultural ways of participating, cultural knowledge. And that in itself can be racist because we take away a very important part of who the students are and their identity. There's also issues with teachers not being able to differentiate between treating all students the same and differentiating students to enable their participation. So the teacher believes it's very important when you look at research, and also when you go into the schools and the classrooms and see what's happening there. Unfortunately, the students might also hold beliefs that can negatively impact them. The teachers think are passive, the students are withdraw because they don't share the classroom norms, they don't really understand how they can participate. They can sometimes feel that there's something wrong with them, and that's why they can't participate in the classroom activities or the assessments. Research shows that many migrant students have lesser self-belief, so that they underestimate their own competence. And research also tells about perseverance or learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is when students, before they enter the classroom, say, I don't understand anything. I never get this. It's so hard. And thereby they kind of say in advance that don't have any expectations to me. I am not going to learn this. So that but if they fail, they don't have to feel embarrassed or sad because they already said so. And sometimes also this learned helplessness is placing the responsibility on the teacher for teaching them, so that they don't have to feel that it's their fault if they don't succeed. And this, of course, is often associated with difficulties really engaging in what's happening in the classroom, and that can also hold the students back. Sometimes when we look at adapting to students to make the assessment more culturally responsive, we talk about how we can individualize, how we can target assessment to the individual student. And this is very at the center of assessment for learning, for instance. But some students come from more collective societies where they are expecting to be responsible as a group for the responses they give, also in assessment situations. And for these students to move into very individualized classrooms and school systems can be challenging. So also taking care of the collective is important. Assessment that is culturally responsive is student-centered, because it is catering for the students, allowing them to show what they can do in a way that enables them to do it. Some students come from very teacher-centered educational systems and move to student-centered systems, and that can be challenging. In a teacher-centered educational systems, the teacher delivers and the students is supposed to, reproduce what the teacher is doing. They're not supposed to display critical thinking. They're not supposed to do problem solving. And if they move to a school where they're supposed to be critical, they don't know what the norms are, how to do this. Of course, it's also difficult to move the other way. And that might hinder students. Language is both key and obstacle. Language is an obstacle if we don't have the language of assessment, if we don't speak it, if we have mathematics assessment that is full of problem solving, embedded problems that we don't understand. Sometimes it might help students if written assessments become oral, because oral language is less rigid. We don't have to express ourselves in the same manners. But language is also key to learning and to assessment situations. And there is a little bit, not a lot, research on how language of schooling can be facilitated in students to enable them to participate in assessment situations. I think this is when we try to move towards assessment and teaching that will, to a large extent, enable equity in schools. But it means that teachers and students and researchers and teacher educators, perhaps even parents, need to unlearn the practices that can negatively impact the students. It means that we need to think about how we can enable critical thinking and problem solving in the students. It means that we need to work with the didactical contracts and classroom norms that enables participation for all students, that these need to be negotiated in the schools. And I think that we've seen some examples of that in the lecture that was before me. It also means involvement from teachers, teacher educators, researchers, students. And it means that we need to adapt and perhaps also include creativity in the assessment situation so that we can better adapt to the individual student and also at the same time cater for this collectiveness. So I think that I might like to try to conclude and say that this review that we've done shows that culturally responsive assessment is student-centered. What I haven't talked about, but maybe you've heard it behind my words or between the lines, is that it necessitates an alignment between curriculum and assessment practices. So that if the curriculum calls for problem solving, investigations, and critical thinking, that needs to be in the assessments. If the curriculum is focused on students reproducing what the teachers have taught them and they get test questions asking for critical thinking, it's impossible. It also means that both the formative and summative assessment needs to be tied to the same competence models. So if we are looking for students' abilities to solve problems, it needs to be present both for the formative assessment that informs the teaching, but also for the summative assessment that we use for grading. It means to allow for diverse response formats. And I think I'll use an example. This is not from the literature review, it's from the case studies that you will hear about later on. But there were some students in one of the schools that we went to that said that they were very afraid of presenting in front of class, but their teachers allowed them to take a video of themselves. That enabled the teacher to look at their oral presentation skills, not to enter into a discussion, but to present. So with a little bit of creativity, and if we allow diverse response formats, it might be possible to adapt procedures better to diverse students. It means that we need to have respect for one another, that we are willing to engage in shaping the classroom norms. And it also means to value students' competence and prior knowledge. that what they bring with them into the classrooms. And then I say thank you.
Thanks very much, Gary. That was extremely interesting and thorough. We have some question time at the end of this session, but if there's anyone who wants to ask a question of clarity or ask Gary anything, we can take one now maybe and then leave the others till the end.
Apparently I was very clear.
You're very clear. Very clear.
You were indeed, Gary. I'm sorry, can I have a question one?
Yeah.
Just the alignment of curriculum and assessment practices. Did you find that was happening in schools?
A lot of the research that looked at this said that when it's not, it's hindering the students. Not only the migrant student though, all the students. So if you look at general research, I think you will find the same. I can't remember ever reading research showing that when it is, it's really good. But I have read a lot of research saying that it's not aligned, so the students don't know what it means to respond. They don't know what's expected from them.
So it's something that school leaders should be working on.
Yes.
In CPD. Right. Gura Magat.
Aniela, anyone else? Okay, Gary, thank you. We'll come back to, I'm sure, further questions at the end.